Hey guys, tonight we begin with the thunderous roar of Viking feasts, those legendary gatherings where warriors, farmers, and seafarers came together to eat, drink, and celebrate in ways that would make modern partygoers look like amateur hour. From massive halls echoing with boisterous laughter to drinking contests that could last for days, Viking feasts weren't just meals. They were epic social events that could determine alliances, settle disputes, or launch the next great raid. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Vikings, you might picture fierce warriors with horned helmets charging across stormy seas, but the reality of their feasting culture was far more complex and wildly entertaining than Hollywood could ever capture. Picture this: you're sitting in a smoky, torch-lit hall where the air is thick with the smell of roasted meat, fermented ale, and unwashed bodies. The wooden tables groan under the weight of whole roasted pigs, massive drinking horns filled to the brim, and enough food to feed a small army. But this wasn't just about filling bellies. These feasts were the beating heart of Viking society, where honor was earned, stories were born, and sometimes blood was spilled over a poorly told joke or an insult to someone's mother. Welcome to the wild, raucous world of Viking hospitality. If you think your living room gets crowded during the holidays, imagine trying to fit 300 drunk, armed Vikings into a single wooden building and calling it a good time. The Great Hall wasn't just the center of Viking social life, it was the beating heart of their entire civilization, a massive timber cathedral dedicated to the twin gods of hospitality and chaos. These weren't cozy family dining rooms with matching furniture and throw pillows. These were architectural monuments to excess, built specifically to contain the kind of revelry that would make modern party planners weep into their clipboards. The scale alone was staggering. A proper Viking Great Hall could stretch over 100 feet in length and 30 feet in width, dimensions that would make your average suburban house look like a garden shed. The largest halls, like the legendary Horde described in Beowulf, were rumored to accommodate upwards of 400 people, all packed together in a writhing mass of humanity, ale, and barely contained violence. But unlike modern event spaces, with their careful fire codes and maximum occupancy limits, Viking halls were designed with a refreshingly casual attitude towards safety regulations. The philosophy seemed to be, if you can squeeze inside without the roof collapsing, welcome to the party. These halls rose from the landscape like wooden leviathans, their steep-pitched roofs cutting dramatic silhouettes against the Nordic sky. The construction was a marvel of medieval engineering, built entirely from massive oak timbers that had been felled, shaped, and fitted together with an expertise that would make modern carpenters pause in respectful admiration. The walls weren't just functional barriers, they were statements of power, wealth, and permanence in a world where most people lived in structures that could charitably be described as temporary. The entrance to a great hall was designed to humble visitors before they even crossed the threshold. Massive wooden doors, often reinforced with iron and carved with intricate patterns, stood between the outside world and the warm, chaotic interior. These weren't subtle entrances. They were declarations of intent, announcing to anyone approaching that they were about to enter a space where normal rules might not apply. The doors were deliberately imposing, tall enough that even the largest warrior would have to crane his neck to take in the full scope of the entrance. It was psychological theater at its finest. By the time you made it inside, you already understood that you were in someone else's domain. Stepping through those doors was like entering another world entirely. The first thing that hit you wasn't the sight, but the sound, a wall of human noise that could be overwhelming to the uninitiated. Conversations, laughter, arguments, and the occasional bellow of rage, all blended together into a symphony of social chaos. The acoustics of these halls were actually quite sophisticated, designed to carry voices clearly across the vast interior space, while somehow managing to contain the worst of the din within the wooden walls. The high, peaked ceiling acted like a natural amplifier, ensuring that a well-delivered boast, or a particularly clever insult, could reach even the farthest corners of the hall. The interior layout followed a carefully orchestrated hierarchy that would make modern corporate seating charts look spontaneous. At one end of the hall, elevated on a raised platform called a dais, sat the high seat, the throne of the Jarl or king who ruled this particular domain. This wasn't just a chair. It was a symbol of authority carved from the finest wood available and often decorated with precious metals, intricate carvings, and sometimes even ivory. The high seat was positioned to give its occupant a commanding view of the entire hall, ensuring that nothing happened without their knowledge and that their presence dominated every gathering. The high seat itself was steeped in religious and mystical significance that went far beyond mere furniture. In Norse mythology, Odin's throne Hidskjalf was said to grant its occupant the ability to see across all the 9 worlds. Viking Jarls took this symbolism seriously, understanding that their high seat wasn't just a place to park themselves. During dinner, it was a sacred space that connected them to the divine authority of the gods themselves. Sitting in the high seat wasn't just about comfort, it was about claiming a direct line to cosmic power, which was probably useful when you needed to settle disputes about who had drunk the last of the mead. Radiating out from the high seat in carefully arranged rows were long wooden tables and benches, positioned according to a social pecking order, so rigid it would make a military mess hall look egalitarian. The closer you sat to the high seat, the higher your status, the better your food, and the more likely you were to survive if things went sideways. The most honored guests and the Jarl's closest retainers occupied the seats immediately adjacent to the platform, basking in proximity to power and enjoying the best view of whatever entertainment was about to unfold. Further down the hall, the seating arrangements became increasingly democratic in the worst possible way. Lesser warriors, farmers, craftsmen, and visitors of questionable reputation found themselves relegated to the far end of the hall, where the acoustics were muddier, the service was slower, and the chances of getting accidentally stabbed during a drunken argument were significantly higher. The very back of the hall, near the entrance, was reserved for the truly unfortunate, thralls, uninvited guests, and anyone who had recently fallen out of favor with the host. These poor souls got to experience the feast while sitting as far as possible from the action, close enough to smell the good food, but far enough away to question their life choices. The physical structure of these halls was an engineering marvel disguised as a party venue. The roof was supported by massive timber posts, each one a tree trunk that had been selected not just for its structural integrity, but for its symbolic value. These weren't random pieces of lumber, they were carefully chosen specimens, often featuring natural curves and grain patterns that the Vikings believed held spiritual significance. The posts were arranged in 2 parallel rows running the length of the hall, creating a central aisle that served as both a processional route and a performance space. The walls themselves told stories. Every available surface was decorated with weapons, shields, tapestries, and carved panels depicting everything from mythological scenes to historical victories. This wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda, autobiography, and museum exhibition all rolled into one. The weapons hanging on the walls weren't just for show, they were trophies, reminders of past battles, and readily accessible backup plans if the evening's entertainment got too enthusiastic. A well-appointed hall might display dozens of swords, axes, and spears, each one with its own story, and each one sharp enough to settle an argument definitively. Lighting in these halls was provided by a combination of oil lamps, candles, and the massive central fire pit that served as both heating system and theatrical focal point. The fire pit was typically positioned in the center of the hall, surrounded by stones, and constantly tended by thralls who had drawn the short straw for evening duties. The smoke from this fire was supposed to escape through openings in the roof, though supposed to was doing a lot of heavy lifting in this arrangement. In practice, most great halls existed in a permanent state of atmospheric haze that gave everything a mysterious, romantic quality, while slowly asphyxiating everyone inside. The smoke situation was actually a carefully calculated trade-off. Yes, the air quality was roughly equivalent to standing downwind from a medieval barbecue pit, but the constant smoke served several practical purposes. It preserved the wooden beams and thatch, keeping insects and rot at bay. It created a natural ventilation system that, while imperfect, was better than nothing. And perhaps most importantly, it gave the entire hall a distinctive smoky aroma that Vikings found as comforting as modern people find the smell of coffee brewing in the morning. The floors of these halls were typically made of packed earth, covered with rushes, straw, or wooden planks, depending on the wealth and pretensions of the owner. The rushes weren't just there for comfort. They served as medieval carpet, absorbing spills, providing insulation, and adding a layer of cushioning that came in handy when people inevitably ended up on the floor. The downside was that these organic floor coverings also absorbed everything else that happened in the hall: food scraps, spilled ale, and various bodily fluids that polite society prefers not to enumerate. By the end of a major feast, the floor covering could charitably be described as well-seasoned. Seating arrangements weren't just about status, they were about survival. The benches themselves were solid wooden affairs, built to withstand the weight of armored warriors and the occasional furniture-related altercation. These weren't delicate pieces of craftsmanship. They were functional chunks of oak, designed to last through decades of abuse. The tables were equally robust, massive slabs of wood, supported by thick legs, and braced to handle the weight of entire roasted animals, barrels of ale, and the inevitable warrior who decided to leap onto the table to deliver an impromptu speech. The high seat deserved special attention, not just because of its symbolic importance, but because of its practical implications. The Jarl's throne was typically positioned to provide the best possible view of the entire hall, while also offering strategic advantages in case of trouble. It was elevated enough to command respect, but not so high as to make the occupant an easy target. The chair itself was often carved with protective symbols, runes, and decorative elements that served both artistic and magical purposes. Many high seats featured carved wolves, ravens, or dragons animals associated with Odin and warfare, making it clear that the person sitting there was under divine protection. The area immediately around the high seat was sacred space, carefully maintained and jealously guarded. Special rugs, furs, or tapestries marked the boundaries of this zone, and crossing into it uninvited was a serious breach of protocol that could result in anything from social humiliation to physical violence. The Jarl's personal drinking horn, weapons, and other ceremonial objects were often displayed nearby, serving as both decoration and subtle reminders of who was in charge. The acoustics of these halls were more sophisticated than you might expect from a building constructed entirely of wood and optimism. The high, peaked ceiling created a natural sound chamber that amplified voices and music while somehow managing to absorb the worst echoes. A skilled Viking, equivalent of a poet laureate, with a side hustle in entertainment, could use these acoustics to dramatic effect, modulating their voice to reach every corner of the hall or dropping to a whisper that would force the entire room to lean forward in anticipation. The temperature inside these halls was a constant battle between physics and wishful thinking. The central fire pit provided warmth, but heating a space that could accommodate hundreds of people with a single fire was optimistic at best. Body heat from the crowd helped, but it also created its own problems in terms of air quality and comfort. The walls and roof provided shelter from the elements, but they weren't exactly airtight. Drafts were a constant companion, and the temperature could vary dramatically depending on where you were sitting and whether you were upwind or downwind from the fire pit. Storage was another practical consideration that shaped the design of these halls. Great feasts required enormous quantities of food, ale, and equipment, all of which had to be stored somewhere accessible, but out of the way. Many halls featured storage chambers built into the walls or positioned in adjoining buildings. These weren't just pantries, they were strategic reserves that could mean the difference between a successful feast and a social disaster. Running out of ale in the middle of a Viking feast wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially dangerous. The Great Hall served multiple functions beyond feasting. During the day, it might host legal proceedings where disputes were settled according to Viking law and custom. The same space that echoed with laughter at night could serve as a courtroom during the day, with the Jarl's high seat transforming from party throne to judge's bench. The hall was also used for religious ceremonies, with the central fire pit serving as an altar for sacrificial offerings to the gods. The same room that hosted raucous drinking contests could become a sacred space for honoring the dead or blessing a new venture. Security was always a consideration in the design of these halls. While they were meant to be welcoming spaces that demonstrated a host's generosity and power, they were also potential targets for raiders or rival clans. The massive wooden doors could be barred from the inside, and the thick walls could withstand a certain amount of assault. Weapons hanging on the walls weren't just decorative, they were a readily accessible armory in case of trouble. The layout of the hall, with its clear sightlines and single main entrance, made it relatively easy to defend if necessary. The maintenance of these halls was a constant undertaking that required significant resources and manpower. The wooden structures needed regular repair and replacement, especially given the harsh Nordic climate and the wear and tear of constant use. The roof had to be rethatched periodically, the walls needed reinforcement, and the fire pit required ongoing attention to prevent accidental fires. The decorative elements, the carvings, tapestries, and weapons needed cleaning and preservation. It was like maintaining a combination museum, restaurant, and fortress, all rolled into one. The Great Hall wasn't just a building, it was a living symbol of Viking values and aspirations. It represented the triumph of human cooperation over the harsh realities of medieval life, a place where individuals could come together to form something greater than the sum of their parts. The hall was where alliances were forged, where stories were preserved, where culture was transmitted from one generation to the next. It was where young warriors learned the codes of honor that would guide their lives, where old fighters could relive their glory days, and where the entire community could gather to celebrate their shared identity. The decline of the Great Hall tradition marked the end of an era in Viking culture. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia and centralized kingdoms replaced the old clan-based system, the need for these massive gathering spaces diminished. Churches took over many of the social and spiritual functions of the Great Hall, while royal courts moved to stone castles that prioritized defense over hospitality. The great halls gradually fell into disuse, their wooden beams rotting away, their stories fading into legend. Today, walking through the excavated remains of a Viking Great Hall is like stepping into the bones of a giant. The massive post holes that once held up the roof are still visible, outlining the footprint of these architectural marvels. Archaeological evidence reveals the careful planning and sophisticated engineering that went into their construction, while also providing glimpses of the daily life that once filled these spaces. Fragments of drinking vessels, gaming pieces, and decorative objects tell the story of people who understood that life was too short and too brutal not to celebrate whenever possible. The Great Hall was more than just a party venue. It was the architectural embodiment of Viking society's highest ideals. It was a place where strength was honored, but so was poetry, where violence was always possible, but so was profound generosity, where the harsh realities of medieval life were temporarily held at bay by the warmth of fire. Fellowship, and fermented beverages. In a world where most buildings were small, temporary, and purely functional, the Great Hall stood as proof that even the most practical people could dream of something grander, something that would outlast their individual lives and inspire stories for generations to come. Standing in the ruins of these halls today, you can almost hear the echoes of ancient laughter, the clash of drinking horns, and the voice of some long-dead skald spinning tales of gods and heroes. The Great Hall was where legends were born, not just in the stories that were told there, but in the very act of creating a space grand enough for legends to feel at home. If you think your family's holiday dinner gets out of hand when Uncle Frank has too much wine, imagine what happened when 300 battle-hardened Vikings gathered around tables, groaning under the weight of entire roasted oxen and barrels of fermented beverages, strong enough to strip paint. Viking feasts weren't just meals, they were epic displays of consumption that would make modern competitive eaters weep with envy and nutritionists faint dead away. This wasn't about sustenance, though the Vikings certainly achieved that goal, and then some. This was about proving that when it came to eating, drinking, and general merriment, nobody did it bigger, louder, or more dangerously than the Norse. The sheer scale of food preparation for a major Viking feast was an undertaking that would challenge modern catering companies. We're talking about events that could feed anywhere from 50 to 500 people, all of whom expected to eat and drink like it was their last night on Earth, which, given Viking lifestyle choices, it very well might have been. The logistics alone were staggering. Imagine trying to coordinate the slaughter, preparation, and cooking of multiple large animals without refrigeration, electric ovens, or even reliable thermometers. Now add the pressure of knowing that if you messed up the feast, you might find yourself on the wrong end of a very sharp axe, wielded by a very drunk warrior. The centerpiece of any proper Viking feast was meat, and lots of it, but we're not talking about modest portions carved from a single roast. Viking feasters demanded entire animals, roasted whole and presented with all the theatrical flair that medieval Scandinavia could muster. A whole roasted ox was the crown jewel of feast foods, a massive beast that had been carefully prepared and slow-cooked over an open fire for the better part of a day. The process began long before the guests arrived, with thralls and servants working in shifts to maintain the proper cooking temperature and ensure that the meat was evenly cooked throughout. The technique for roasting such enormous pieces of meat was surprisingly sophisticated. The Vikings used a combination of direct heat from massive fire pits and indirect heat from carefully arranged coals to create what was essentially a primitive but effective outdoor oven. The meat was turned regularly on massive spitsum, of which required multiple people to operate, ensuring even cooking and that distinctive crispy exterior that made the presentation so impressive. The fat that dripped from the roasting meat wasn't wasted. It was collected and used for cooking other dishes, creating a cascade of flavors that permeated everything else on the menu. Pork was equally popular and perhaps even more practical for large gatherings. Whole roasted pigs were common feast fare, and the Vikings had developed techniques for preparing them that maximized both flavor and presentation. The pig would be stuffed with various herbs, grains, and sometimes smaller cuts of meat, creating a kind of medieval turducken that could feed dozens of people. The skin was scored in intricate patterns that allowed the fat to render properly, while creating an attractive presentation that demonstrated the cook's skill and attention to detail. But the Vikings didn't limit themselves to just the obvious cuts of meat. They embraced nose-to-tail eating with an enthusiasm that would make modern farm-to-table chefs look squeamish. Organ meats weren't just accepted, they were prized delicacies that often went to the most honored guests. Blood sausages, kidney puddings, and liver preparations were common feast foods, prepared with spices and techniques that elevated them far beyond mere subsistence eating. The Vikings understood that wasting any part of an animal was not just economically foolish, but spiritually problematic. The gods didn't look kindly on wasteful people. Lamb and mutton featured prominently in areas where sheep farming was practical, and the Vikings developed sophisticated methods for preparing these meats that went far beyond simple roasting. Slow braised lamb shoulders, stuffed with wild herbs and vegetables, were common feast dishes. The meat would be wrapped in the animal's own skin, along with aromatic plants, and buried in specially prepared fire pits, where it would cook slowly for hours, emerging tender enough to fall off the bone and infused with complex, earthy flavors. Game meats added both variety and prestige to the feast table. Venison, from red deer and elk, was particularly prized, not just for its flavor, but for what it represented. Successful hunting required skill, courage, and no small amount of luck. A feast featuring fresh venison was a statement that the host had the resources and connections to obtain the finest foods available. Wild boar was another prestigious addition to the feast table, dangerous to hunt and requiring careful preparation due to its tough, gamey meat. The Vikings were also enthusiastic consumers of poultry, though their approach to chicken, goose, and duck was characteristically ambitious. Rather than serving individual portions, they often prepared entire flocks of birds, roasted and presented in elaborate arrangements that showcased both abundance and culinary skill. Geese were particularly popular for their fat content, which could be rendered and used for cooking other dishes. The Vikings had learned that goose fat was superior to other animal fats for certain cooking applications, and a successful goose hunt could provide not just meat for the feast, but cooking medium for weeks to come. Seafood played a crucial role in Viking feasts, particularly in coastal communities where fresh fish and other marine delicacies were readily available. But this wasn't just about grilled salmon and pickled herring, though both of those featured prominently on feast tables. The Vikings had developed sophisticated techniques for preparing everything from massive cod to delicate shellfish. Whole salmon, stuffed with herbs and wrapped in seaweed, were buried in sand pits beneath carefully tended fires, emerging hours later, perfectly cooked and infused with subtle smoky flavors. The preservation techniques used by Vikings were nothing short of remarkable, allowing them to serve foods that had been stored for months or even years without spoiling. Salt-cured meats were common feast foods, prepared using sea salt and various spice blends that not only preserved the meat, but enhanced its flavor. The Vikings had learned that different cuts of meat required different curing techniques, and they had developed specialized methods for everything from thin slices of beef to whole sides of pork. Smoking was another crucial preservation technique that doubled as a flavor enhancement method. Viking smokehouses were sophisticated operations that could handle large quantities of meat and fish simultaneously. Different types of wood were used for different food soak for beef, apple for pork, juniper for fish, creating distinct flavor profiles that became part of regional culinary traditions. The smoking process could take days or even weeks, requiring constant attention and adjustment to maintain the proper temperature and smoke density. Fermentation wasn't limited to alcoholic beverages. The Vikings used fermented foods extensively in their feast preparations. Fermented fish sauces, similar to modern Asian fish sauces, were used as seasoning agents that added complex umami flavors to otherwise simple dishes. Fermented vegetables, particularly cabbage and root vegetables, provided both nutrition and flavor during the long winter months when fresh produce was scarce. The bread served at Viking feasts was far more sophisticated than the simple flat breads that many people associate with medieval eating. Skilled bakers prepared elaborate loaves using various grains: barley, rye, wheat, when available often incorporating nuts, seeds, and dried fruits. Some feast breads were shaped into intricate designs or molded into symbolic forms that related to the occasion being celebrated. The ovens used for baking these breads were substantial stone structures that could handle multiple loaves simultaneously and maintain even temperatures for hours. Dairy products featured prominently in Viking feasts, though not always in forms that modern diners would recognize. Fresh milk was a luxury that was often reserved for children and the elderly, but fermented dairy products were common and highly prized. Skyr, a thick, tangy cheese, similar to modern Greek yogurt, was a feast staple that could be flavored with herbs, honey, or fruit. Various hard cheeses, aged in caves or buried in the earth, provided protein and flavor that could last through long sea voyages or harsh winters. Butter was more than just a cooking ingredient. It was a luxury item that demonstrated wealth and status. The butter served at Viking feasts was often flavored with herbs or shaped into decorative forms that showcased the skill of whoever had prepared it. Some feast butters were aged for months in specially prepared containers, developing complex flavors that rivaled modern artisanal varieties. Vegetables and fruits, while not the stars of Viking feasts, played important supporting roles that added both nutrition and flavor to the meal. Root vegetable turnips, parsnips, carrots were roasted in the coals of the great fires, emerging sweet and caramelized. Cabbage was prepared in various ways, from simple boiled preparations to complex fermented dishes that could be stored for months. Onions and leeks were used extensively as both ingredients and seasonings, adding depth and complexity to meat dishes. Wild berries and fruits were incorporated into feast menus when available, often in the form of preserves, sauces, or fermented beverages. Cloudberries, lingonberries, and various wild apples were prized not just for their flavor, but for their scarcity and the effort required to obtain them. A feast featuring fresh berries was a sign that the host had resources and connections that extended far beyond their immediate territory. The seasoning and spicing of Viking feast foods was more sophisticated than many people realize. While exotic spices from distant lands were expensive and rare, the Vikings made extensive use of local herbs and seasonings. Wild garlic, dill, caraway, and various other herbs were used fresh when available and dried for use throughout the year. Salt was precious, but essential, used not just for preservation, but for enhancing the flavors of feast foods. Some Viking communities had access to imported spices through trade networks that stretched across Europe and beyond. Pepper, cinnamon, and other exotic seasonings occasionally appeared at the most elaborate feasts, demonstrating the host's wealth and connections. These spices were used sparingly, both because of their cost and because Viking palates were accustomed to the more subtle flavors of local ingredients. The cooking equipment used for Viking feasts was specialized and substantial. Massive iron cauldrons, some large enough to cook entire animals, were suspended over fires using elaborate pulley and chain systems. These cauldrons were often family heirlooms, passed down through generations and prized for their size and quality. Roasting spits were equally impressive, some measuring more than 10 feet in length and requiring multiple people to operate safely. Clay ovens and baking stones allowed for more sophisticated cooking techniques than simple roasting over open fires. These ovens could maintain steady temperatures for hours, enabling the preparation of breads, pies, and other baked goods that required consistent heat. The construction and maintenance of these ovens required considerable skill and represented a significant investment in cooking infrastructure. Now, if the food at Viking feasts was impressive, the drinking was legendary. Viking beverages weren't just about quenching thirst, they were about proving your capacity for consumption, while maintaining enough coordination to avoid insulting someone important or falling face first into the fire pit. The alcohol content of Viking beverages was formidable by any standard, and the quantities consumed would have impressed even the most dedicated modern college students. Mead was the king of Viking beverages, a fermented honey wine that could range from sweet and mild to potent enough to strip the hair off a goat. The production of mead was both an art and a science, requiring careful attention to fermentation temperatures, honey quality, and timing. The best mead was aged for months or even years, developing complex flavors and alcohol content that could reach levels comparable to modern fortified wines. The honey used for mead production was often flavored with various herbs and spices, creating different varieties of the beverage. Some meads were infused with juniper berries, giving them a gin-like flavor profile. Others incorporated wild berries or tree saps, creating sweet, fruity beverages that masked their considerable alcoholic strength. The most prized meads were those made with honey from specific types of flowers or trees, creating unique flavor profiles that became associated with particular regions or producers. Ale was the everyday drinking beverage of Vikings, but feast ales were special preparations that went far beyond simple fermented grain beverages. These ales were often spiced with bog myrtle, hops, or various herbs that not only flavored the drink, but acted as natural preservatives. The alcohol content of feast ales was typically higher than everyday varieties, sometimes approaching the strength of modern wines. The brewing process for feast ales was a community effort that began weeks before the actual event. Massive quantities of grain had to be malted, which involved carefully controlling the germination process to convert starches into fermentable sugars. The malted grain was then mashed with hot water in huge vats, creating a sweet liquid called wort. This wort was boiled with various herbs and spices before being cooled and fermented with wild yeasts or carefully maintained yeast cultures. Beer was another popular feast beverage, though the distinction between ale and beer in Viking times was somewhat different from modern brewing terminology. Viking beers were often stronger and more heavily spiced than contemporary versions, with alcohol contents that could reach dangerous levels. Some feast beers were aged in wooden barrels for months, developing complex flavors and potency that made them suitable for special occasions. Wine was a luxury item in most Viking communities, imported from southern Europe through extensive trade networks. The wine that appeared at Viking feasts was often fortified or spiced, both to preserve it during long journeys and to suit Viking tastes that favored strong, complex flavors. Some imported wines were mixed with local honey or herbs, creating hybrid beverages that combined the prestige of foreign ingredients with familiar local flavors. The drinking vessels used at Viking feasts were as important as the beverages themselves. Drinking horns, carved from cattle or other large animals, were not just functional containers, but status symbols that demonstrated the owner's wealth and success. The largest drinking horns could hold more than a quart of liquid, and emptying one in a single session was considered a mark of honor, at least stubbornness. The horns themselves were often decorated with intricate metalwork, carved designs, or precious stones that showcased the artistic skills of Viking craftsmen. Some drinking horns were passed down through families for generations, accumulating history and significance with each use. The most elaborate horns were reserved for the most important guests or the most significant toasts, making them part of the ceremonial aspect of feasting. Wooden cups and bowls were more common for everyday drinking, but feast vessels were often elaborate affairs, carved from single pieces of wood and decorated with intricate designs. These vessels were sized according to social status. Higher-ranking guests received larger, more ornate cups, while lesser attendees made do with smaller, simpler vessels. The size of your drinking vessel wasn't just about capacity, it was a visible indicator of your place in the social hierarchy. Metal drinking vessels, typically made from silver or bronze, were the ultimate luxury items at Viking feasts. These cups and bowls were often imported from distant lands or crafted by the most skilled local metalworkers. They were prized not just for their beauty, but for their practicality. Metal vessels didn't break like pottery or absorb flavors like wood, making them ideal for serving the finest beverages to the most honored guests. The serving of beverages at Viking feasts followed strict protocols that reflected social hierarchies and cultural values. The most honored guests were served first, often by the host's own family members as a sign of respect. The quality and strength of the beverages improved as you moved closer to the high seat, with the Jarl and his immediate companions receiving the finest mead and ales, while lesser attendees made do with whatever was left. The alcohol consumption at these feasts was truly staggering by modern standards. Vikings didn't sip their beverages. They drank with purpose and enthusiasm that would challenge modern fraternity parties. Drinking contests were common entertainment, with participants competing to see who could consume the most alcohol while still maintaining basic motor functions. These contests weren't just about capacity. They were tests of masculine honor and endurance that could have serious social consequences. The effects of this massive alcohol consumption were exactly what you'd expect from giving several hundred armed warriors enough fermented beverages to float a longship. Inhibitions disappeared, emotions ran high, and the line between friendly competition and deadly conflict became increasingly blurry as the evening progressed. Many of the legendary feuds and violent episodes associated with Viking feasts can be traced directly to the combination of high-proof beverages and easily wounded pride. The morning after a major Viking feast was undoubtedly a sobering experience in every sense of the word. Hangovers were probably epic affairs that lasted for days, and the cleanup must have been a monumental undertaking. Imagine trying to restore order to a great hall that had hosted 300 drunk Vikings the night before. Broken furniture, spilled food, mysterious stains, and the occasional unconscious warrior who hadn't quite made it home. Despite the apparent chaos and excess, Viking feast foods and beverages represented sophisticated culinary traditions that had been developed over centuries. The techniques used for preservation, preparation, and presentation were passed down through families and communities, creating regional variations and specialties that reflected local resources and preferences. These weren't just drunken brawls with food, they were cultural institutions that preserved and transmitted important knowledge about cooking, brewing, and hospitality. The cleanup and food storage after a major feast was almost as complex as the preparation. Leftover meat had to be preserved quickly to prevent spoilage, often by smoking, salting, or rendering into fat that could be stored for months. Remaining beverages were carefully stored in sealed containers, with the strongest varieties reserved for future special occasions. Even food scraps weren't wasted. They were fed to livestock or composted to enrich the soil for next year's crops. The economic impact of these feasts on Viking communities was substantial. A major feast could consume months' worth of stored food and beverages, representing a significant investment in social capital and political influence. Hosts had to balance the desire to impress guests with the practical need to maintain adequate supplies for their households and dependents. Running out of food or drink during a feast wasn't just embarrassing, it could damage a leader's reputation for years to come. The seasonal timing of feasts was crucial, both for practical and symbolic reasons. Major feasts were often scheduled around agricultural cycles, taking advantage of fresh harvests and the abundance that followed successful growing seasons. Winter feasts served a different purpose, helping communities get through the darkest months by providing social connection and depleting stored supplies that might spoil before spring arrived. Standing in the ruins of a Viking Great Hall today, it's hard to imagine the sensory overload that these feasts must have provided. The combination of smoke from cooking fires, the aroma of roasting meat, the sounds of hundreds of people eating and drinking with Viking-level enthusiasm, and the visual spectacle of whole roasted animals and elaborately decorated drinking vessels must have been overwhelming. Add the effects of potent alcoholic beverages, and you have a recipe for experiences that would linger in memory for years, assuming you remembered them at all. The legacy of Viking feast culture extends far beyond simple historical curiosity. These gatherings represented a fundamental human need for community, celebration, and shared experience that transcends time and culture. In a harsh world where survival was never guaranteed, the Vikings understood that life was too precious and too precarious not to celebrate whenever possible. Their feasts were expressions of joy, defiance, and human connection that turned simple sustenance into something approaching art. The next time you complain about your dinner getting cold or your wine not being the right temperature. Spare a thought for the Viking feast-goers, who considered it a successful evening if they managed to consume enough mead to pickle their internal organs, while avoiding getting stabbed by someone who disagreed with their assessment of the roast pork. They understood something that modern fine dining has perhaps forgotten. Sometimes the best meals aren't about perfect preparation or elegant presentation, but about gathering with your people and eating like the world might end tomorrow, because in their world, it very well might. If you think modern drinking games are intense because someone has to chug a beer when they miss a ping-pong shot, you clearly haven't heard about Viking entertainment, where the evening's fun could easily end with someone getting their skull caved in over a poorly delivered insult, or drinking themselves into a coma that lasted 3 days. Viking feasts weren't just about eating massive quantities of food and consuming enough alcohol to pickle a small whale. They were about proving your worth through a series of increasingly dangerous competitions that would make modern extreme sports look like gentle parlor games. This wasn't entertainment in the sense of passively watching someone else perform. This was participatory theatre, where the audience was also the cast. The stakes were your reputation and possibly your life, and the only rule was that backing down was worse than dying. The Vikings understood something that modern party planners have perhaps forgotten. Nothing brings people together quite like the shared risk of public humiliation or accidental death. Their feast entertainment was designed to test every aspect of what they considered essential. Viking qualities, your capacity for alcohol, your wit, your courage, your ability to craft a devastating insult, and your skill at turning your own life story into an epic poem that would make listeners weep with either admiration or laughter. It was like a combination of American Idol, Fear Factor, and a poetry slam, except everyone was armed and drunk. The drinking competitions alone were enough to hospitalize half the participants before the real entertainment even began. These weren't casual affairs where you sipped ale until you felt pleasantly tipsy and called it a night. Viking drinking contests were methodical, ritualized attempts to discover the absolute upper limits of human alcohol tolerance while maintaining enough cognitive function to insult your opponents coherently. The goal wasn't just to outdrink your competitors. It was to do so while demonstrating that alcohol only made you more eloquent, more clever, and more dangerous. The most basic drinking competition was the simple endurance contest, where participants lined up with identical drinking vessels, often massive horns that could hold upwards of a quartand, attempted to drink their opponents under the table. The rules were straightforward. Drink when everyone else drinks, keep pace with the fastest drinker, and whatever you do, don't vomit, fall over, or pass out before your competitors do. Failure resulted in immediate disqualification and the kind of social humiliation that could follow you for years. But the Vikings, being Vikings, couldn't leave it at simple endurance. They developed elaborate variations that added layers of skill and danger to the basic concept. One popular competition involved drinking from horns while standing on one-footer test that combined alcohol tolerance with balance and resulted in some spectacular failures that provided entertainment for everyone except the participant, currently face down in the rushes. Another variation required participants to drink while reciting poetry, testing whether alcohol improved or destroyed your ability to remember complex verses under pressure. The most dangerous drinking competition was probably the drink and debate format, where participants had to consume increasingly large quantities of alcohol while engaging in formal arguments about everything from theology to battle tactics. The theory was that a true Viking should be able to think clearly and argue persuasively, no matter how much mead was clouding their judgment. In practice, these debates often devolved into increasingly creative insults that could easily escalate into violence if someone crossed the wrong line or questioned someone's ancestry a little too enthusiastically. The drinking vessels themselves became part of the competition. The largest horns were reserved for the most ambitious contestants, and being able to drain a truly massive horn in one continuous effort was considered a feat worthy of its own saga. Some horns were decorated with intricate metalwork that made them heavier and more difficult to handle, adding an element of physical challenge to the drinking. The most elaborate horns had no flat bottom, meaning they couldn't be set down once you started drinking. You either finished the contents or wore them. The social dynamics of drinking competitions were complex and often brutal. Winners gained prestige and the right to boast about their victory for years to come. Losers faced not just the physical consequences of massive alcohol consumption, but the social consequences of public failure. A warrior who couldn't hold his drink was considered unreliable in battle, unsuitable for important responsibilities, and generally lacking in the essential Viking virtues. The pressure to participate and succeed was enormous, leading to some truly heroic, catastrophic attempts at alcohol consumption. The morning after cleanup from these drinking competitions must have been a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to restore order to a great hall where dozens of warriors had competed to see who could consume the most fermented beverages while maintaining basic motor functions. The casualty rate was probably significant, and the hangovers were undoubtedly legendary. Some participants probably didn't regain full consciousness for days, leading to the practical problem of what to do with unconscious warriors sprawled around the hall. But drinking was just the appetizer in the feast of Viking entertainment. The main course was flighting, the ancient Scandinavian art of competitive insult, hurling that turned verbal sparring into a blood sport conducted entirely with words. If you've ever witnessed a rap battle or watched comedians roast each other, you've seen a pale, sanitized version of what the Vikings elevated to an art form that could be more devastating than actual warfare. Flighting wasn't just trading insults. It was a sophisticated form of verbal combat that required quick wit, extensive vocabulary, deep knowledge of your opponent's personal history and family background, and the ability to deliver devastating character assassinations in perfect, poetic meter. The best flighting practitioners, known as skalds, could destroy someone's reputation so thoroughly with nothing but carefully chosen words that their victim would be socially ruined for life. It was psychological warfare conducted with poetry, and the Vikings took it very seriously indeed. The rules of flighting were deceptively simple, but incredibly difficult to master. Participants took turns delivering insults in verse form, usually following strict poetic conventions that required complex rhyme schemes and alliteration. The insults had to be original, clever, and devastating, but they also had to follow the formal rules of Norse poetry. It wasn't enough to simply call someone names. You had to do it with style, creativity, and technical skill that demonstrated your mastery of language and literature. The subject matter for flighting ranged from personal attacks on physical appearance and sexual prowess to complex genealogical insults that traced someone's shameful ancestry back several generations. The best flighting attacks were those that contained enough truth to sting while being delivered with such wit and creativity that even the target had to admire the craftsmanship. A truly masterful insult could simultaneously destroy someone's reputation and establish your own as a poet worth respecting. The audience played a crucial role in flighting competitions, serving as both judges and potential targets. A successful insult would provoke laughter, gasps, or expressions of admiration from the crowd, while a weak attempt would be met with silence or, worse, counterattacks from the audience themselves. The pressure to perform was intense, as failure in flighting could be more humiliating than failure in drinking competitions or even in battle. Some flighting sessions became legendary, with participants trading increasingly elaborate insults for hours, while the audience hung on every word. These verbal duels could be more entertaining than any other form of feast entertainment, especially when both participants were skilled practitioners who could match each other wit for wit. The best flighting battles were remembered and retold for years, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved the cleverest insults and most devastating put-downs for future generations. The personal nature of flighting meant that these competitions often dredged up old grudges, family scandals, and embarrassing incidents that participants might have preferred to keep private. A skilled fighter would research their opponents beforehand, gathering ammunition in the form of embarrassing stories, family secrets, and personal weaknesses that could be weaponized in verse form. The result was a form of entertainment that was part poetry contest, part psychological warfare, and part public therapy session. The line between playful flighting and serious insult was thin and often crossed accidentally or deliberately. What started as friendly competition could quickly escalate into genuine hostility if someone went too far or touched on a subject that was off limits. The rules governing what constituted acceptable flighting versus actionable insult were complex and varied from region to region, leading to misunderstandings that could have serious consequences. Some insults were considered so clever or well-crafted that even their targets would acknowledge their quality, leading to the paradoxical situation where being brilliantly insulted could actually enhance your reputation if you took it with good grace. The ability to appreciate a good insult directed at yourself was considered a mark of sophistication and self-confidence that could win you respect, even in defeat. The physical dangers of flighting were real and significant. While the competition itself was verbal, the emotions it generated were genuine, and it wasn't uncommon for flighting sessions to end in actual violence when someone's honor was called into question or a particularly sensitive subject was broached. The combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and deadly weapons made flighting a genuinely dangerous form of entertainment that could easily escalate beyond mere words. Complementing the art of insult was the equally competitive practice of boasting, the ritualized recounting of one's own achievements in a manner designed to impress listeners while simultaneously challenging them to match or exceed your accomplishments. Viking boasting wasn't the casual bragging you might encounter at a modern cocktail party. It was a formal performance art that required careful preparation, dramatic delivery, and the ability to make your life sound like an epic saga, even if your greatest achievement was successfully catching a particularly large fish. The structure of Viking boasting followed established patterns that audiences expected and appreciated. A proper boast began with a recounting of your ancestry, establishing your noble lineage and the heroic deeds of your forebears. This wasn't just self-aggrandizement, it was a way of placing yourself within the larger narrative of your family and clan, showing that heroism ran in your blood and that your own achievements were the continuation of a long tradition of excellence. The core of the boast focused on your personal accomplishments, but these had to be presented in a way that maximized their impact while maintaining at least a veneer of truth. A successful trading voyage might be described as a death-defying journey through monster-infested waters to exotic lands where you outwitted cunning foreign merchants and returned with treasures beyond imagination. A minor skirmish with bandits could become an epic battle against overwhelming odds where your skill with weapons turned certain defeat into glorious victory. The art was in the telling how you could take genuine achievements and present them in a way that made them sound legendary without crossing the line into obvious fabrication. The audience was sophisticated enough to recognize exaggeration and appreciate skillful embellishment, but they would not tolerate outright lies, especially if there were witnesses present who could contradict your version of events. The competitive aspect of boasting came from the implicit challenge that each recounting presented to other potential speakers. When you finished describing your heroic deeds, you were essentially daring anyone present to top your achievements with stories of their own. This created an escalating cycle of one-upmanship, where each speaker had to match or exceed the previous boaster's accomplishments, leading to increasingly elaborate and dramatic recountings as the evening progressed. The pressure to participate in boasting competitions was significant, especially for warriors and leaders whose reputations depended on their ability to demonstrate their worth through both deeds and words. Refusing to boast when challenged was almost as damaging as boasting poorly, as it suggested either that you had no achievements worth mentioning or that you lacked the confidence to present them effectively. The timing and setting of boasts were crucial to their effectiveness. The best boasts were delivered at moments of maximum dramatic impact, often after particularly impressive drinking feats or successful flighting exchanges that had warmed up the audience and demonstrated the speaker's overall capabilities. The atmosphere in the hall, the quality of the audience, and the amount of alcohol consumed all influenced how boasts were received and remembered. Some boasting sessions became collaborative efforts where multiple participants worked together to tell the story of a shared adventure, each adding their own perspective and details to create a more complete and entertaining narrative. These group boasts were particularly effective because they provided multiple witnesses to verify the basic facts while allowing for creative embellishment and dramatic enhancement. The consequences of poor boasting could be severe and long-lasting. A boast that was obviously false, poorly delivered, or that claimed achievements beyond the speaker's actual capabilities could result in public ridicule that damaged their reputation for years. Warriors who couldn't boast effectively were considered unreliable and unsuitable for leadership positions, as the ability to present oneself persuasively was seen as essential for inspiring confidence in followers. The relationship between boasting and actual achievement was complex and symbiotic. Successful boasting required genuine accomplishments to build upon, but it also inspired listeners to seek out their own heroic deeds, so they would have material for future boasts. The practice created a positive feedback loop, where the desire to have impressive stories to tell motivated people to take risks and pursue achievements that they might otherwise have avoided. Professional entertainers, known as skalds, elevated all these competitive forms to true art. These weren't just talented amateurs showing off at parties. They were skilled professionals whose livelihoods depended on their ability to compose, memorize, and perform complex works that could hold the attention of demanding audiences for hours at a time. A good skald was worth their weight in silver, capable of transforming an ordinary feast into a memorable cultural event that would be talked about for years. The training required to become a successful skald was extensive and demanding. They had to master complex poetic forms, memorize vast quantities of traditional stories and genealogies, develop the performance skills necessary to hold an audience's attention, and cultivate the quick wit required for improvisational composition. Many skalds spent years as apprentices, learning their craft from established masters, and gradually building their repertoires of stories, poems, and techniques. The poems composed and performed by skalds weren't simple entertainment. They were sophisticated works of art that preserved historical events, celebrated heroic deeds, and transmitted cultural values from one generation to the next. A skald's version of events could become the official historical record, making their role similar to that of modern journalists, historians, and poets combined into a single profession. The competitive nature of skaldic performance meant that these artists were constantly trying to outdo each other with increasingly elaborate and impressive compositions. Skalds would compete to see who could compose the most complex verse forms, who could improvise the cleverest responses to unexpected challenges, and who could hold an audience's attention for the longest period without losing their interest. The improvisational skills required for skaldic performance were particularly impressive, as good skalds were expected to be able to compose original works on the spot in response to current events or specific requests from their audiences. This required not just poetic skill, but also quick thinking, extensive general knowledge, and the ability to work within the strict formal constraints of Norse poetry, while making the results sound effortless and natural. The social status of skalds was unique in Viking society, as they occupied a position that was both honored and precarious. On one hand, they were valued for their skills, and often enjoyed the patronage of wealthy and powerful figures who wanted their deeds immortalized in verse. On the other hand, their livelihood depended on their ability to please audiences and patrons, making them vulnerable to changes in taste, political shifts, or simply having an off night when their usual skills failed them. The performance venues for skalds ranged from intimate gatherings in small halls to major feasts that could attract hundreds of listeners. The scale of the venue influenced both the style of performance and the type of material presented, with intimate settings allowing for more personal and subtle works, while large gatherings demanded more dramatic and broadly appealing compositions. The relationship between alcohol and skaldic performance was complex and often problematic. While a moderate amount of drinking could enhance both the performer's confidence and the audience's appreciation, too much alcohol could destroy the concentration and precision required for complex poetic composition. Skalds had to walk a fine line between participating enough in the drinking to maintain their connection with the audience and maintaining enough sobriety to perform at their best. The morning after, a major feast featuring competitive entertainment was probably a sobering experience in every sense of the word. The hall would be littered with the casualties of drinking competitions, failed flighting attempts, and overly ambitious boasting sessions. Warriors who had seemed invincible the night before would wake up with crushing hangovers and the gradually dawning realization that they might have said or done things that could have serious social consequences. The social aftermath of feast entertainment could last for months or even years. Particularly clever insults or impressive boasts would be remembered and repeated, becoming part of the ongoing narrative of community life. Feuds that started during flighting sessions could escalate into serious conflicts that affected entire families or clans. Reputations could be made or destroyed in a single evening, depending on how well individuals performed under the pressure of competitive entertainment. The cleanup wasn't just physical, but social and political as well. Hosts had to deal with the aftermath of conflicts that had erupted during their feasts, mediating disputes and trying to prevent minor disagreements from escalating into major feuds. The success of a feast was measured not just by how much food was consumed or how entertaining the performances were, but by whether the host managed to maintain social harmony and avoid major disasters. Yet despite the risks and potential consequences, these forms of competitive entertainment served crucial social functions that went far beyond mere amusement. They provided outlets for aggression and competition that might otherwise have resulted in actual violence. They reinforced cultural values and social hierarchies, while also allowing for their occasional subversion through clever wit or exceptional performance. They preserved historical memory and transmitted cultural knowledge through memorable and entertaining formats. The legacy of Viking competitive entertainment can still be seen in modern forms of verbal sparring, from rap battles to roast comedy to competitive poetry slams. The fundamental human pleasure in witty insults, clever wordplay, and competitive performance has remained constant even as the specific forms and contexts have evolved. What the Vikings understood, and what modern entertainers continue to exploit, is that audiences love watching people take risks, whether physical, social, or emotional, and that the combination of skill, courage, and alcohol can produce both brilliant art and spectacular disasters. Standing in the ruins of a Viking great hall today, it's easy to imagine the echoes of ancient laughter, the rhythmic pounding of drinking horns on wooden tables, and the sharp crack of a particularly devastating insult, delivered with perfect timing and deadly accuracy. These weren't just parties, they were cultural laboratories where the essential elements of human nature, competition, creativity, pride, and the desperate need to be remembered were distilled into concentrated forms that could both elevate and destroy the participants. The next time you're at a gathering where someone tells a mildly exaggerated story about their weekend adventures or makes a gentle joke at a friend's expense, remember the Viking feasters who turned these basic human impulses into high-stakes entertainment that could literally be a matter of life and death. They understood that the best entertainment isn't just about having few-nits, about testing yourself against others and discovering whether you have what it takes to not just survive, But to be memorable in a world where being forgotten was the cruelest fate of all. If you think modern etiquette is complicated because you're unsure which fork to use for the salad course, try navigating a Viking feast where using the wrong drinking horn could get you killed, sitting in the wrong seat could start a blood feud that lasted generations, and failing to offer proper hospitality to your worst enemy was considered a sin against the gods themselves. What looked like 300 drunk warriors eating and drinking themselves into oblivion was actually one of the most highly regulated social events in medieval Europe, governed by an intricate web of laws, customs, and sacred obligations that would make modern diplomatic protocol look like a casual backyard barbecue. The Vikings understood something that modern party planners have largely forgotten. The more potential there is for chaos, the more structure you need to prevent that chaos from destroying everyone involved. These weren't lawless gatherings where anything went. They were carefully orchestrated social theatres, where every gesture, every word, and every cup of mead was freighted with meaning that could determine the fate of individuals, families, and entire communities. Break the wrong rule, insult the wrong person, or fail to observe the proper protocols, and you might find yourself on the wrong end of a blood feud that would make the Hatfields and McCoys look like a minor neighborhood dispute. At the heart of Viking feast, culture was the concept of hospitality, lawa, sacred obligation, that transcended personal feelings, political differences, and even active warfare. Once you offered someone food and drink under your roof, they became your guest, and that status came with protections so absolute that violating them was considered one of the most serious crimes imaginable. This wasn't just a nice social custom, it was a religious obligation backed by the gods themselves, and breaking it could bring divine punishment down on your entire household. The hospitality laws were both beautifully simple and maddeningly complex. The basic principle was straightforward. Anyone who entered your hall and partook of your food and drink was under your protection for the duration of their stay and for a reasonable time after they left. During this period, you were obligated to defend them from harm, provide them with adequate food and shelter, and treat them with the respect due to an honored guest, regardless of who they were or what they might have done to you in the past. This created some fascinating paradoxes that would challenge even the most creative modern diplomats. Enemy warriors, who had been trying to kill each other on the battlefield in the afternoon, could find themselves sharing mead and making polite conversation at the same feast table that evening, protected by laws so sacred that violating them was literally unthinkable. The same man who had burned your village and killed your cattle could become your honored guest if he showed up at your door requesting hospitality, and you were not only obligated to receive him, but to do so graciously. The practical implications of these laws were staggering. Imagine running a household where you might be required at any moment to provide food, shelter, and protection to someone who had recently murdered your brother, stolen your livestock, or carried off your daughter. Yet this is exactly what Viking hospitality law demanded, and failure to comply could result in social ostracism, divine punishment, and the complete destruction of your reputation in the community. The gods took hospitality seriously, particularly Odin, who was known to wander the world in disguise, testing the hospitality of mortals. The stories of divine visitors, rewarding generous hosts, and punishing stingy ones, weren't just entertaining tales, they were moral instruction manuals that reinforced the absolute importance of proper hospitality. The fear that any shabby-looking traveler might be a god in disguise ensured that even the poorest households would share their last crust of bread with unexpected visitors. The duration of guest protection was carefully regulated and universally understood. A guest was considered under your protection for 3 days and nights, during which time they could eat your food, sleep under your roof, and expect your active defense against any threats. After 3 days, the obligation expired, and the guest was expected to continue on their way or risk becoming an unwelcome burden on their host's resources. The quality of hospitality offered had to match the status of both host and guest, creating a complex calculus that required careful consideration of social hierarchies, personal wealth, and political relationships. A wealthy Jarl was expected to offer more lavish hospitality than a poor farmer, but even the poorest household was obligated to share what they had. The key was proportionality. You had to offer the best you could afford, not necessarily the best available in absolute terms. Refusing hospitality was possible, but carried serious social consequences. A host could turn away a potential guest, but only before offering them food or drink. Once you had provided even a sip of water or a crust of bread, the guest relationship was established and could not be revoked. This led to some interesting strategic considerations, as hosts had to quickly evaluate whether they wanted to assume the obligations that came with accepting a particular visitor. The physical act of offering hospitality followed specific rituals that formalized the relationship and made it clear to all present that guest-host obligations were now in effect. The most common ritual involved the host personally offering the newcomer a drink, often from their own cup or horn, symbolically sharing their substance and establishing the sacred bond. This ceremony was taken so seriously that even enemies would observe it scrupulously, understanding that their own survival might one day depend on others respecting the same customs. The protection offered to guests extended beyond the physical to include their reputation and honor. A host was obligated to defend their guest against insults, slander, and attacks on their character, even if those attacks came from the host's own family members or closest allies. This could create incredibly awkward situations where people were forced to defend individuals they personally despised simply because they had accepted the obligations of hospitality. Seating arrangements at Viking feasts were another minefield of social protocol that could trigger conflicts lasting for generations. Where you sat wasn't just about comfort or convenience. It was a public declaration of your status, your relationship to the host, and your place in the complex hierarchy that governed Viking society. Get the seating wrong, and you could inadvertently insult someone so badly that they would feel obligated to challenge you to combat or launch a blood feud against your entire family. The high seat occupied by the Jarl or king wasn't just the best chair in the house. It was a throne with mystical significance that connected its occupant to the divine authority of the gods. Sitting in someone else's high seat without permission wasn't just rude, it was a direct challenge to their authority and legitimacy that could justify immediate violent retaliation. Even approaching the high seat uninvited could be interpreted as a hostile act, making the area around it a zone of extreme social danger. The seats immediately adjacent to the high seat were reserved for the most honored guests and the host's closest advisors, positioned to facilitate quiet conversations about important matters, while also demonstrating their elevated status to everyone else in the hall. These prime spots were allocated according to a complex algorithm that took into account political alliances, family relationships, recent achievements, and the delicate balance of egos that had to be maintained to prevent the feast from dissolving into violence. Moving down from the high seat, each row of benches represented a step down in the social hierarchy, with positions allocated according to factors including military rank, wealth, family connections, and personal achievements. The seating plan for a major feast required diplomatic skills that would challenge modern United Nations protocol officers, as hosts had to balance competing claims for status while avoiding arrangements that would offend anyone important enough to cause serious trouble. The consequences of improper seating could be immediate and severe. Warriors who felt they had been seated below their proper station might interpret this as a deliberate insult that required violent response to preserve their honor. Placing someone in a seat that implied higher status than they actually possessed could anger those who felt their own positions were being diminished. Even well-intentioned mistakes could trigger conflicts that would outlast the individuals who made them. The complexity of seating arrangements increased exponentially with the size and importance of the gathering. A feast for 50 local warriors was challenging enough, but major assemblies that brought together hundreds of participants from different regions, clans, and political factions required months of advanced planning and careful negotiation. Some hosts employed specialists whose sole job was managing seating arrangements and preventing the diplomatic disasters that could result from careless placement. Changes in seating assignments over time served as a public barometer of shifting political relationships and social status. Being moved closer to the high seat indicated rising influence and favor, while being relocated further away signaled declining status or political disagreement. These movements were closely watched by all attendees and could have implications that extended far beyond the immediate gathering. The protocol surrounding who could sit where was complicated by the fluid nature of Viking society, where status could change rapidly based on recent achievements, political developments, or shifts in personal relationships. A successful raid could elevate a minor warrior to a position requiring better seating, while a political misstep could result in a formally important figure being relegated to the back benches. Hosts had to stay current with these changes and adjust their seating plans accordingly. Honor codes governing behavior at feasts were equally complex and absolutely binding for anyone who wanted to maintain their reputation and social standing. These weren't written laws that could be looked up in a book. They were cultural imperatives, transmitted through generations of oral tradition and reinforced by the constant threat of social ostracism or violent retaliation for violations. The fundamental principle underlying all feast behavior was the concept of worthiness, the idea that everything you did in public reflected not just on yourself, but on your family, your clan, and your ancestors stretching back to the beginning of time. This created enormous pressure to behave in ways that demonstrated courage, generosity, wisdom, and all the other virtues that Vikings considered essential to proper manhood or womanhood. Personal insults at feasts were governed by elaborate rules that distinguished between acceptable, challenging banter and unforgivable attacks on someone's honor. The line between these categories was often thin and always dangerous, as what started as friendly competition could quickly escalate into deadly conflict if someone crossed boundaries that weren't always clearly marked. The art of feast conversation required the ability to engage in spirited verbal combat without accidentally triggering a blood feud. The obligation to defend your honor extended beyond just responding to direct attacks. It included the responsibility to speak up when you witnessed injustice or heard someone spreading false information about people under your protection. Remaining silent when your honor or that of your associates was under attack was considered cowardice that could permanently damage your reputation and social standing. Generosity was perhaps the most important virtue displayed at feasts, but it too was governed by complex rules that determined how much was appropriate, to whom it should be directed, and in what manner it should be offered. Being generous was essential, but being too generous could be interpreted as showing off or attempting to embarrass others who couldn't match your largesse. Not being generous enough was even worse, marking you as stingy and unsuitable for leadership or respect. The gift-giving that accompanied major feasts followed intricate protocols that would challenge modern diplomats. Gifts had to be appropriate to the relationship between giver and recipient, valuable enough to demonstrate respect, but not so valuable as to create uncomfortable obligations or implications of subservience. The timing, manner, and public presentation of gifts were all fraught with potential for misunderstanding or offense. Reciprocity was a fundamental principle that governed all social interactions at feasts. Accepting hospitality, gifts, or even compliments created obligations that had to be discharged appropriately, or risk being seen as taking advantage of others' generosity. The calculation of what constituted appropriate reciprocity was complex and required detailed knowledge of social relationships, personal circumstances, and cultural expectations. The role of women in feast protocols was carefully defined, but varied significantly, depending on their social status, family relationships, and personal circumstances. High-ranking women could wield considerable influence in feast settings, often serving as informal mediators who could diffuse tensions between male participants before they escalated into violence. The Lady of the Hall typically played a crucial role in welcoming guests and ensuring proper hospitality was observed. Women's participation in feast activities was governed by different rules than those applied to men, but these rules were no less important or binding. A woman's behavior at a feast reflected on her family's honor just as much as her male relatives' actions, and she could be held accountable for violations of protocol or failures to meet social expectations. The penalties for women who violated feast protocols could be just as severe as those faced by men, including social ostracism and damage to marriage prospects. The enforcement of feast protocols was largely self-regulating, relying on social pressure and the threat of retaliation rather than formal legal mechanisms. Everyone present served as both participant and enforcer, watching for violations and ready to respond appropriately when rules were broken. This created an atmosphere of constant vigilance, where even small mistakes could have serious consequences. The consequences for violating feast protocols ranged from mild social embarrassment to immediate physical violence, depending on the severity of the violation and the individuals involved. Minor breaches might result in public correction or private discussion designed to prevent future mistakes. More serious violations could trigger formal challenges, demands for compensation, or the initiation of blood feuds that could last for generations. The collective memory of the community served as the ultimate enforcement mechanism for feast protocols. Stories of both exemplary behavior and serious violations were remembered and retold for years, creating a permanent record that influenced how individuals were perceived and treated in future social situations. A single major breach of protocol could define someone's reputation for their entire life. The arbitration of disputes that arose from feast protocol violations required considerable skill and diplomatic ability. Hosts often found themselves in the position of mediating between guests who felt they had been wronged, trying to find solutions that preserved everyone's honor while preventing violence that could disrupt the gathering and damage their own reputation as gracious hosts. The seasonal variation in feast protocols reflected the agricultural and military cycles that governed Viking life. Winter feasts, held when communities were largely confined to their settlements, followed different rules than summer gatherings that might include visitors from distant lands. The protocols for feasts celebrating military victories differed from those marking religious holidays or important life events like marriages or funerals. The integration of religious observances into feast protocols added another layer of complexity that required careful attention to divine requirements, as well as human social expectations. Offerings to the gods, ritual toasts, and ceremonial activities had to be conducted according to strict religious protocols, while also serving the social functions that made feasts important community events. The economic implications of feast protocols were substantial, as hosts were expected to demonstrate their wealth and status through lavish hospitality, while also observing rules about appropriate generosity that could drain their resources if not carefully managed. The pressure to maintain standards worthy of one's social position could drive families into debt or force them to make difficult choices about resource allocation. The political dimensions of feast protocols were equally important, as these gatherings served as venues for forming alliances, negotiating agreements, and demonstrating power relationships that could influence everything from trade arrangements to military campaigns. The protocols governing political discussions at feasts required sophisticated understanding of diplomatic conventions as well as social etiquette. The educational function of feast protocols cannot be overstated, as these events served as practical training grounds where young people learned the complex social skills they would need to navigate adult Viking society successfully. Observing and gradually participating in feast activities provided hands-on education in diplomacy, social hierarchy, and cultural values that no amount of formal instruction could duplicate. The preservation of feast protocols through oral tradition required constant reinforcement and adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles that defined Viking cultural identity. Each generation had to learn not just the specific rules, but also the underlying values and reasoning that made those rules necessary and legitimate. The decline of traditional feast protocols marked the end of an era in Viking society, as changing political structures, religious conversion, and cultural contact with other European peoples gradually undermined the social systems that had made these elaborate gatherings necessary and effective. The replacement of traditional feast culture with Christian ceremonies and continental European court customs represented a fundamental transformation in how Scandinavian communities organized their social lives. Modern observers, looking back at Viking feast protocols, might be tempted to see them as unnecessarily complex or even absurd, but they served crucial functions in societies that lacked the formal legal and political institutions that modern people take for granted. In a world where personal reputation was often the only protection against violence and exploitation, the elaborate rules governing social interaction provided essential frameworks for maintaining order and preventing chaos. The legacy of Viking feast protocols can still be seen in modern Scandinavian culture, where concepts of hospitality, social equality, and collective responsibility continue to influence everything from business practices to political institutions. The emphasis on consensus building, respectful discussion, and generous treatment of guests that characterized Viking feasts has evolved but not disappeared from contemporary Nordic societies. If you think navigating the office holiday party is stressful because you might accidentally insult your boss or drink too much and embarrass yourself, spare a thought for the Viking feast attendees who had to master protocols so complex that a single mistake could result in violent death or social ostracism that would destroy their family's reputation for generations. They understood that civilization isn't the absence of rule sets, the presence of enough rules, carefully observed, to allow large groups of armed, intoxicated, and emotionally volatile people to gather together and somehow avoid killing each other before dessert was served. If you think modern dinner parties can get awkward when someone brings up politics or your drunk uncle starts telling inappropriate stories, imagine attending a Viking feast where disagreements were settled with battle axes and the evening's entertainment could literally include watching your host murder someone over a perceived slight about their mother's cooking. What began as celebrations of community, prosperity, and shared cultural values could transform with terrifying speed into blood-soaked disasters that left entire families dead and sparked conflicts lasting for generations. This wasn't just about too much alcohol leading to bad decisions, though there was certainly plenty of that. This was about a culture where honor was more valuable than life, where insults demanded immediate violent response, and where the same sacred laws of hospitality that protected guests could be cynically manipulated to lure enemies into carefully planned massacres. The transformation from joyous celebration to deadly conflict could happen with shocking suddenness, triggered by incidents so minor that modern observers might dismiss them as petty misunderstandings. A poorly timed joke, a drinking horn offered to the wrong person first, a seat assignment that implied insufficient respect to any of these, could serve as the spark that ignited violence capable of consuming everyone present. The Vikings lived in a world where reputation was currency, where perceived weakness invited attack, and where the failure to respond to insults with appropriate force marked you as unworthy of respect or protection. The role of alcohol in these violent eruptions cannot be overstated, though it would be simplistic to blame everything on drunkenness. Viking feast beverages weren't just strong, they were psychoactive cocktails that could push already volatile personalities past the point of rational decision-making while simultaneously removing the social inhibitions that normally prevented minor disagreements from escalating into lethal conflicts. Mead and ale didn't create the underlying tensions that existed between individuals, families, and clans. They simply stripped away the veneer of civility that usually kept those tensions from exploding into open warfare. The progression from celebration to carnage typically followed predictable patterns that experienced feast-goers learned to recognize and, if they were smart, avoid. The evening would begin with standard protocols carefully observed, proper toasts offered, and conversations conducted within acceptable bounds of friendly competition and ritualized boasting. But as the alcohol flowed and inhibitions dissolved, the verbal sparring would become sharper, the challenges more pointed, and the responses more aggressive. The tipping point often came during the competitive entertainment that was central to Viking feast culture. Flighting sessions that began as playful verbal duels could escalate when someone crossed the invisible line between acceptable insult and unforgivable character assassination. Drinking contests that started as friendly competitions could turn deadly when losing became a matter of public humiliation that demanded violent redemption. Boasting sessions could transform into dangerous confrontations when someone's claims to heroic achievement were challenged by witnesses who remembered events differently. The physical environment of Viking halls, designed to accommodate large numbers of people in close quarters, became a liability when violence erupted. The same intimate setting that fostered community bonding also meant that conflicts couldn't be easily contained or isolated. When weapons were always within reach, hanging decoratively on walls or worn as status symbols, the transition from angry words to deadly action required only seconds. The narrow aisles between benches that facilitated service became killing corridors when armed warriors decided that honor demanded immediate satisfaction. The code of honor that governed Viking society created a social framework where violence wasn't just acceptable, but often mandatory. A warrior who failed to respond to insults with appropriate force wasn't just personally dishonored, he endangered his family's reputation and his clan's standing in the community. This created a situation where backing down from confrontation, even over trivial matters, could have consequences that lasted for generations. Better to die fighting over a perceived slight than to live with the shame of being known as someone who couldn't defend his honor. The concept of collective responsibility meant that violence at feasts rarely remained limited to the original participants. When someone was killed or seriously injured, their family members and clan associates were obligated to seek revenge, creating cycles of retaliation that could consume entire communities. A feast that ended with one dead warrior could trigger a blood feud involving dozens of families and lasting for decades. The original cause of the conflict often became irrelevant as subsequent generations inherited both the obligation to seek vengeance and the targets of that vengeance. Women played complex roles in feast violence, both as potential victims and as active participants in the conflicts that erupted. High-status women could sometimes diffuse tensions through diplomatic intervention, using their positions as neutral parties to mediate between angry warriors before weapons were drawn. But they could also become catalysts for violence when their honor was impugned, or when they themselves issued challenges that their male relatives were obligated to pursue. The legal framework surrounding feast violence was sophisticated, but often inadequate to prevent or resolve conflicts once they began. While there were established procedures for seeking compensation for injuries or deaths, these mechanisms only worked when all parties were willing to accept negotiated settlements rather than pursuing violent revenge. The heat of the moment, combined with alcohol and wounded pride, often made rational legal solutions impossible to achieve. Some feast violence was spontaneous and unplanned, erupting from the volatile combination of alcohol, ego, and easy access to weapons. But other incidents were carefully orchestrated affairs where hosts used the sacred obligations of hospitality to lure enemies into situations where they could be eliminated without apparent violation of social codes. The most notorious of these planned massacres required months of preparation and diplomatic maneuvering to ensure that the intended victims would accept invitations and attend events where they could be safely killed. The hall burning was perhaps the most dramatic and effective method of feast violence, involving the systematic murder of everyone present through the simple expedient of barring the doors and setting the building on fire. This technique was particularly favored for eliminating entire rival families or political factions in a single operation. The perpetrators could claim that their enemies had died in an unfortunate accident while maintaining plausible deniability about their own involvement in the tragedy. The logistics of hall burning required careful planning and considerable manpower to execute successfully. The building had to be surrounded to prevent escape, while combustible materials were arranged to ensure rapid and complete destruction. The timing had to be perfect too early, and the victims might fight their way out too late, and they might become suspicious and leave before the trap could be sprung. The social cover story had to be believable enough to avoid immediate retaliation from surviving relatives or allies. Historical accounts of successful hall burnings read like military operations disguised as social events. The host would extend seemingly generous invitations to their intended victims, often using intermediaries to make the invitations appear more legitimate and less suspicious. The feast would proceed normally until the critical moment when doors were barred and fires set, transforming what had appeared to be a celebration into a carefully planned execution. The psychological impact of hall burning extended far beyond the immediate victims to create fear and paranoia throughout Viking society. If the sacred laws of hospitality could be violated so completely and with such devastating effect, then no one was safe anywhere. The knowledge that any invitation to feast could potentially be a death trap made social interactions infinitely more complex and dangerous, as potential guests had to weigh the risks of accepting hospitality against the social consequences of refusing it. Defense against hall burning required constant vigilance and sophisticated counterintelligence operations. Smart warriors would send trusted scouts to examine feast venues beforehand, looking for signs of preparation that might indicate hostile intent. They would arrange for armed allies to remain outside the hall during festivities, ready to intervene if the doors were suddenly barred. Some particularly paranoid individuals would refuse to attend any feast where they couldn't personally control the security arrangements. The famous burning of Njal's house, immortalized in Njal's saga, demonstrates both the effectiveness and the long-term consequences of using feast violence for political ends. The attackers succeeded in eliminating their primary targets, but also created a legacy of shame and blood debt that haunted their families for generations. The saga's detailed account of the planning, execution, and aftermath of the burning provides insights into how these operations were conducted and why they were both feared and despised, even in a culture that generally accepted violence as a legitimate means of resolving disputes. The weaponry available at Viking feasts was both extensive and easily accessible, creating an environment where minor disagreements could quickly escalate into deadly conflicts. Swords, axes, and daggers weren't just tools of war. They were status symbols, worn or displayed as demonstrations of wealth and martial prowess. The same weapons that decorated the walls of great halls could be quickly requisitioned when honor demanded violent satisfaction. The preferred weapons for feast violence were those that could be drawn quickly and used effectively in close quarters. Seax's long knives that were carried by virtually every adult male were particularly popular for intimate conflict because they were always available and could be concealed until the moment of attack. Eating knives, while smaller and less effective than purpose-built weapons, were omnipresent at feast tables and could serve as weapons of last resort. The tactical challenges of fighting inside crowded halls required specialized skills that differed significantly from battlefield combat. The narrow spaces between benches and tables made it difficult to use longer weapons effectively, while the presence of non-combatants complicated targeting and movement. Warriors who were skilled in open combat might find themselves at a disadvantage in the confined space of a great hall, where agility and quick reflexes were often more important than raw strength or weapon mastery. The aftermath of feast violence was complicated by the legal and social obligations that governed Viking society. Bodies had to be disposed of properly, blood money had to be negotiated, and the complex web of relationships that connected all members of the community had to be somehow restored to functional equilibrium. The cleanup wasn't just physical, it was social, legal, and spiritual as well. The economic consequences of feast violence could be devastating for entire communities. When prominent warriors were killed, their households lost not just their leadership, but their primary sources of income and protection. The blood feuds that resulted from feast violence could disrupt trade relationships, agricultural cooperation, and military alliances that communities depended on for survival and prosperity. The political manipulation of feast violence reached its most sophisticated expression in the use of calculated provocations to justify larger military actions. Ambitious leaders would deliberately insult or threaten rivals during public feasts, knowing that their targets would be obligated by honor codes to respond with violence. The resulting conflicts could then be used as pretexts for raids, conquests, or other military adventures that had been planned well in advance. The Feast of Bjarni Brod Helgason provides a classic example of how political ambition could transform social gathering into military recruitment. The host used carefully planned insults and challenges to goad his guests into making public commitments to join military expeditions they might otherwise have avoided. By the end of the evening, what had begun as a simple harvest celebration had become a war council planning raids that would affect the entire region. The treaty-making function of feasts added another layer of complexity to their potential for violence. The same gatherings where peace agreements were negotiated and sealed could become targets for those who opposed the proposed treaties. Assassinations during peace feasts were particularly effective because they eliminated political opponents while simultaneously destroying the diplomatic processes that might have prevented larger conflicts. The sacred nature of treaty-making feasts theoretically provided protection for participants, but this protection was only as strong as the commitment of all parties to honor their agreements. When political stakes were high enough, some leaders were willing to accept the spiritual and social consequences of violating hospitality laws in order to achieve their military or political objectives. The role of alcohol in treaty negotiations was double-edged, as the same beverages that loosened tongues and encouraged frank discussion also impaired judgment and increased the likelihood of misunderstandings that could derail diplomatic processes. Many potentially successful peace negotiations were sabotaged by drunken outbursts or poorly timed jokes that offended one party or another. The seasonal timing of violent feasts often reflected the agricultural and military cycles that governed Viking society. Winter feasts, when communities were largely confined to their settlements, became venues for settling scores that had accumulated during the active campaigning season. Spring feasts often served as recruitment drives for raiding expeditions, while autumn celebrations provided opportunities to distribute the profits of successful campaigns and plan for the following year's activities. The relationship between religious observance and feast violence was complex and often contradictory. The same festivals that celebrated the gods and sought their blessings could become occasions for violence that violated the very spiritual principles being honored. The presence of religious authority figures sometimes helped to prevent or control conflicts, but it could also provide legitimacy for violence that was framed as divinely sanctioned punishment for transgressions against cosmic order. The preservation of feast violence in saga literature serves multiple functions beyond simple historical record-keeping. These stories provided entertainment value through their dramatic narratives of conflict and revenge, but they also served as cautionary tales, warning against the dangers of unchecked pride and uncontrolled aggression. The detailed descriptions of feast violence in sagas often emphasized the tragic consequences of conflicts that could have been avoided through better judgment or more effective diplomacy. The literary treatment of feast violence reflects the ambivalent attitudes that Viking society held toward this phenomenon. While violence was accepted and even admired as a demonstration of courage and honor, its destructive consequences for individuals, families, and communities were also recognized and regretted. The sagas often present feast violence as simultaneously inevitable and tragic, reflecting the complex moral framework within which Vikings understood the role of conflict in their society. The decline of feast violence paralleled the broader transformation of Scandinavian society as Christianity replaced traditional religious practices and centralized kingdoms imposed more effective legal systems. The new religious framework provided alternative mechanisms for resolving disputes, while stronger royal authority created consequences for violence that outweighed the social benefits of maintaining personal honor through combat. The legacy of Viking feast violence can be seen in modern Scandinavian cultural attitudes toward alcohol, social behavior, and conflict resolution. The contemporary emphasis on consensus building and peaceful dispute resolution reflects lessons learned from centuries of experience with the destructive consequences of allowing minor disagreements to escalate into major conflicts. The archaeological evidence from excavated Viking halls provides physical testimony to the reality of feast violence, with burned structures, scattered weapons, and human remains bearing evidence of violent death. These material remains confirm that the saga accounts of feast violence, while often embellished for dramatic effect, were based on real experiences that shaped the daily lives of Viking communities. The comparative study of feast violence in other medieval cultures reveals that this phenomenon was not unique to Scandinavian society, but reflected broader patterns of behavior common to warrior cultures throughout Europe. The specific forms that feast violence took among the Vikings were shaped by their particular social structures, legal traditions, and cultural values, but the underlying dynamics of alcohol, honor, and violence were widely shared across medieval civilization. If you think your family holiday gatherings are tense because Uncle Bob gets political after a few drinks and Aunt Sarah brings up old grievances from 20 years ago, consider yourself fortunate that your relatives probably won't try to burn down the house with everyone inside or challenge each other to death duels over who gets the last dinner roll. The Vikings understood that bringing large groups of armed, proud, and intoxicated people together for social gatherings was inherently dangerous, but they also recognized that these risks were worth taking for the benefits that communal celebration provided to their society. They learned to live with the possibility that any feast might be their last, and in doing so, they created a culture that valued both friendship and honor so highly that people were willing to die for both sometimes in the same evening, and sometimes over matters so trivial that their grandchildren would struggle to understand what all the fuss had been about.